Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be with you this morning, stroke into the afternoon. Um, when we had our worship at the start of this morning, I felt very much at home. Um, my journey includes time in the Methodist Church, and when I was a colleague of Jasmine's at Stetts down in Salisbury, we shared our ecumenical practices with worship, and I felt right at home this morning, quite far from the office of morning prayer, which I was leading earlier, which is also good, but there we are. I want to probably talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. So I'm hoping we will have some time for Q&A via the chat. Uh, I really enjoyed Catherine's talk earlier, and I feel that there is quite a strong link between what she said and what I'd like to share with you. Though we didn't collude at all. We just prepared what we felt we wanted to say, and thanks to God, there seems to be quite a lot of connections. I also observe, and it's part of what I want to say, is that the group we're in this morning is made up largely of women. Probably 3/4 of us present here are women, and I think that's important. It's also important to observe that I think Jasmine is the only black person present this morning, and I think that's also important, and I think that resonates with what Catherine spoke about earlier. But here goes. My title is I Can't Breathe, a Loud Cry and Then Silence, meditating on that one verse in Mark 15, verse 27, where Jesus breathes his last, where Jesus exhales and dies. And I've been pondering what the pandemic has done for us. And of course, one of the things that happened during the pandemic last year, in the middle of last year, was the sudden eruption of anger and grief and outrage at the death of George Floyd. And it was a moment when the world was convulsed by an awareness of the kind of problems with empire and power and police control that Catherine was referring to this morning. So I thought it would be good to just read the death of Jesus, as it were, through the lens of the death of George. And then, of course, in the last week or so, we've had the death of Sarah, and we need to read the death of Jesus through the death of Sarah and the outrage and grief that has erupted as we have tried to make sense of it. Now, I'm not very good with technology, but I want to share my screen. So hopefully I'll be able to share my PowerPoint screen with you. Just bear with me if I make sure I get that right, which will give you a sense of where we're going. As I say, I'm not very confident, so it takes a moment before I do it. Let's hoping that that's where we are. And if I can just there we go. And so there's my title, Meditating on the Last Breath of Jesus, George Floyd, Sarah Everard, and the millions who have died from respiratory failure during the COVID-19 pandemic. So and let me just move to the next screen, which gives you an overview of what I want to say. So there they are, reflecting on the fact that this phrase "can't breathe" has become a marker of our time. And then we move on to Mark's Passion narrative, Jesus' death, and we zoom down right to that one verse 27 of chapter 15, his last words, his last breath. And then we try and zoom out again through the lens of George Floyd's death and the patients on COVID-19 wards. And then we see where we've got to. So the arrival of COVID-19 and the sudden, at first mysterious need for ventilators took us all by surprise last year. Ventilators? What? And then in the summer of the pandemic, George Floyd was arrested by police in Minneapolis and pinned down while he struggled and groaned. I can't breathe. His hands were handcuffed behind his back, and he seemed to be in great discomfort as the police tried to impose control upon him. Resonates with Catherine's words. But the outcome of that imposition of control, subduing him, was that he died on the street. And that triggered the worldwide protest, which we now know as Black Lives Matter. And we know that the trial of the policeman who had his knee on George's neck for about 8 or 9 minutes is still just in the early stages in the United States. And then just last week at the vigil for Sarah Everard, women were pinned to the ground before being handcuffed and arrested. And in the name of the same, we must impose control. We have to stop people behaving in a way that doesn't fit in with the empire's concerns and values, with COVID-19 regulations. And once again, there was an outpouring of anger and grief, which hasn't yet been processed. And the latest is that there are serious calls for a revision of the COVID regulations to allow the people to express their anger and protest. If we step back a little, the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're in, didn't come from nowhere. And people reflect on the fact that it has its origins in the abuse of the natural world. It's not to say somebody did something in China alone which caused this to spread, but the way we've abused the natural world behind the COVID crisis is the climate crisis. And again, as Catherine reminded us, we're also living in a global context of the after effects of the 19th and 20th centuries colonial escapades and the racism which that has left across the world. And then, as I say, again recently, not for the first time, Sarah Everard's death has highlighted the violence imposed upon women, the violence that women are experiencing. Those are just 3 themes. But of course, this week in the news, we've seen horrific reports of the violence being imposed upon women in northern Ethiopia, Eritrea, around that region, where women are being used as pawns in a regional war, and terrible violence is being exerted upon them and upon their children. More locally, in my city of Manchester and of course London, people have also begun to be asking questions about the way police power is used. And the local policing policies in Greater Manchester are under special measures. And we've noticed the concerns about how the Sarah Everard protest was handled in London. We've also noticed on our screens, TV screens, the way the army has been deployed, most recently in Myanmar, before that in Hong Kong, where violence has been imposed upon the people of those countries. And so it's in the context of that situation, that global situation, that I'd like us to read Mark's account of the last minutes of Jesus' life, and setting those last minutes in the context of Jesus, the last hour of Jesus' life, or perhaps even the Passion narrative. Now, you'll remember that it's commonplace to think of Mark's gospel falling into two parts. The first part being chapters 1 to 8, which is a wonderful journey of triumph and progress, right from chapter 1. Again, as Catherine mentioned, we see things going well. Things go from strength to strength. The kingdom is proclaimed, people are healed, the gospel is proclaimed, as it were, the kingdom of God is proclaimed. And then in chapters 9 to 16, if chapters 1 to 8 is an upward trajectory, 9 to 16 is seen, if one wants to think schematically, as a downward trajectory. And as Jesus turns towards Jerusalem, to his suffering and death there, and the pivotal moment between those two things is, of course, his transfiguration. And on the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus meets Moses and Elijah. Moses, of course, the hero of the Exodus story, which we were thinking about earlier. And Elijah, the figure who appears at the moment of Jesus' death, at least in Jesus' mind. But at that transitional point in the middle of Mark, chapters 8, 9, and 10, all have moments where Jesus says, the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected, killed, and rise again. 8:31, 9:31, and 10:32. But the story of the final conflict begins from the moment where Jesus makes his Palm Sunday triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And that runs through to chapter 15 with his death on the cross. And I want to zoom in, particularly, as I say, to the last day of his life. We sometimes forget that the passion of Jesus was actually very quick. And from the Last Supper and his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, his arrest, his interrogation, first by the Jewish authorities in the middle of the night, and then his appearance before Pilate early in the morning. According to Mark, by 9 o'clock, Jesus was on the cross. That chronology can be, doesn't relate exactly to what the other gospel writers say, but there is that speed, and perhaps that's typical of Mark. Things happen quickly. There was hardly time to think as the sudden events of Jesus' arrest and death just flowed through so quickly. And on the morning of his death, assuming that Mark's chronology is right, he suffers between 9 a.m. and 12 noon, watched by curious spectators, and then at noon, according to Mark, darkness falls on the earth until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So let's read Mark's account in Mark 15:33 to 39. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, he is calling for Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was God's son. As I say, it's wonderful the way Catherine's earlier presentation resonates with this. And when we start looking through that post-colonial lens, things jump out at us. And the torn temple, the curtain, and the centurion. There's the representative of the empire, literally in person, watching this thing happen. Now, one of the interpretive issues that we face when we read any part of the Gospels, but certainly here, and the other accounts of the Passion narratives in Matthew, Luke, and John, is how much is symbolic and how much describes what actually took place. One of the symbolic markers, I think, is the darkness at noon. I find it unpersuasive when people talk about lunar eclipses or solar eclipses or some other, they look around for some kind of literal explanation for the account that there was darkness at noon. I think it's a bit like looking for the star that led the wise men. I think it's symbolic. You're free to disagree. Just as Arthur Koestler once wrote a novel called Darkness at Noon about the 1939 Moscow treason trials. He was taking that symbol and using it in this way. But for me, the darkness at noon, between 12 and 3, symbolizes when the whole natural order has gone out of alignment. And last spring, we experienced this feeling that it should be spring, but we're locked indoors. Or it should be a great time of the year, but everything is shut down. Just when life returns, so life was, as it were, locked down and shut down. And we were all faced with the terrible fear that nature was going to kill us rather than, as it were, renew us. So the darkness at noon is a symbol of the whole created order in protest. And if one reads with the whole Bible in mind, one thinks of Genesis chapter 1, where God says, let there be light. And it's almost as if that is reversed, and darkness instead. Let there be darkness becomes the message. And so too with the tearing of the temple curtain. It symbolized then the end of an old era. And it symbolizes that the old ways of doing religion were not going to be possible again. Things would not be the same. And I think in the same way, we realize that things are not going to be the same again religiously after this pandemic. Again, it's a matter for reflection and discussion. I think we're gradually learning as we go through a second year of dealing with this pandemic that we are not just going to be, it's not just going to be a blip and we all go back to normal. And that's not going to be true of the church as well as, if you like, our view of the natural world. So these are just two of the symbolic events in Mark that Mark places at this point in the story. And you'll know that Matthew adds others, such as an earthquake, the opening up of the graves, and the saints walking around, seen walking around in Jerusalem. Again, I think these are symbolic. Again, you're free to differ, but they are at least symbolic. And they are marking a kind of cataclysmic and life-changing moment. And many would say that we, living through this global pandemic, are going through a world-changing event similar to that, and one or similar, shall we say, to the cataclysm of the Second World War, perhaps even more so, because it's affected people in every part of the world. Let's move on to to Jesus' last words and last breath. Just remind us of our flow. Jesus' last words are from Psalm 22, verse 1. Are they symbolic too? Well, unlike the whole question of darkness covering the whole earth, it seems to me entirely plausible that as Jesus' life came to an end, he did cry out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" And it's also plausible, particularly as those words are quoted in Aramaic or Hebrew in the different Gospels, that Eloi, Eloi, or Eli, Eli might have been misunderstood by the bystanders as representing a call to Elijah for help. And it's quite likely that he would have cried out again at the very end of his life, though the words are not stated, but perhaps he repeated at least the first words, my God, before breathing out his last breath. That's just a guess from me, but it seems entirely plausible that Jesus did use those last words from Psalm 22, verse 1. But beyond that, it's the word used by Matthew and Mark to describe his death as exhaling his last breath that resonates with me this year, this Lent. You see, Jesus' passion has always been described in relation to contemporary culture and circumstances. And there's some wonderful examples of that in Ulrich Lutz's commentary on Matthew in the Hermeneia series. It's quite an expensive book, but it's a wonderful 3-volume commentary. And Ulrich Lutz uses art to show how through the centuries Jesus' death has been understood and interpreted in different historical contexts. So I'm saying to us, we need to say, how are we interpreting Jesus' death today? How will you preach on Good Friday about the death of Jesus? And it seems to me the issue is the question, what do we most need to be saved from? And how does Jesus' actions connect with that? How does Jesus' role connect with that? You'll remember that during the First World War, there was a poet called Edward Shillitoe who wrote a poem, Jesus of the Scars. Wonderful poem. You might look it up it's easily available on the web. But essentially, the message there in that poem was, unless we have a scarred Jesus, a person whose body shows the wounds, that Jesus has nothing to say to the people whose lives and bodies were broken in the trenches. Later in the 60s, we had, in the countercultural or ban the bomb era, we had the anti-war Jesus in the kind of authentic, slightly later on, where authenticity was a value. You remember, you've got to be real, man. Coca-Cola came up with the slogan, Coke, it's the real thing. And Jesus, Christians came up with slogans that said, Jesus Christ, he's the real thing. So there was this kind of, you see the way in every stage and era, we need to look at Jesus' death and Jesus' ministry in the light of our circumstances. Long ago, in the 80s, I bought Hans Ruedi Weber's book, On a Friday Noon, Meditations on the Cross, where he used pictures from artists to meditate on that. And I think that was then taken up in the Christ We Share pack, which has been widely used since then. So I just want to remind you of one of the most famous pictures, which describes, which presents the picture of the tortured Jesus of Latin America in the 20th century. So just moving on to remind you of Guido Rocha's The Tortured Christ. You may be familiar with this picture. I remember when I first saw it, it was unforgettable and has been unforgettable, and still for me is one of the few kind of crucifixes that I think helps to connect the suffering of the 20th century with Jesus' suffering on the cross. but there's worse. And at the risk of distressing you, I would like us to view an even more distressing, because real, video report of some of the last minutes of George Floyd's life as captured on Minneapolis police and CCTV cameras and reported in a US news report. Do invite you, if this helps you, to view the unedited 1-hour footage of police video cameras from 2 of the policemen, their report on, or their recording of George Floyd's arrest and death, and comparing that with that of Jesus, as George Floyd breathes his last, and then as Jesus breathes his last, and their lifeless bodies are taken away. There's a whole tradition of representing of paintings of Jesus' body taken down from the cross, and the body that cries out is now limp. And in the one police camera footage shows George Floyd's limp, and we know now lifeless body being put on a stretcher and then taken into an ambulance. Suddenly in the ambulance, they attach him to all manner of wonderful life-saving equipment, and including a mechanical respirator, and a machine pulls George's lungs up and down, up and down, up and down. And that contrasts so dramatically with the unwillingness of the police officers to respond to George's cry, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." This is very current, as I say, the trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer whose knee on the neck of George Floyd led to his death, still proceeds at this time. The heartbreaking thing about this story is it's not unique. We've witnessed the deaths of many other innocent people since then. And of course, in the background, COVID-19 has taken thousands upon thousands. But night after night on our TV screens, we see news of soldiers or police firing tear gas and live ammunition at protesters, and the scenes of the dying and the dead being carried away. And as I say, recently, we felt the pain of the innocent, violent death of Sarah Everard and the suppression of a public vigil for her. Now, we view these things as outsiders, trying to imagine the experience of those who are dying and how to think about it. And the gospel writers do that too. They show us Jesus' death. They enable us to put ourselves in the shoes of the onlookers. And they also draw us into the experience of Jesus' own death through symbols, such as the darkness and his last words. So we are bystanders, but we are bystanders with insight. In the video recordings of George Floyd's death, we hear the voices of those watching, speaking to George, "You can't win," speaking to the police, "You killed that man, bro," as they struggle to make sense of what is unfolding before their very eyes. And George's own words convey his inner experience from his first words as the police approach him. When the police come to him and he's still sitting in the car, the body cam of the police records him saying, "Please don't shoot me." When the police approach George Floyd, his first words are, "Please don't shoot me." These are the police whose motto is to serve and protect. At least they are in New York City. And then George's experience is expressed in his cries and groans throughout. He cries out even as he suffocates. And we hear him calling, "Tell my children I love them," and calling out for his mama. And we hear again on the police video cam elsewhere, one of the police says to him, "You're using a lot of oxygen for someone who can't breathe." But let's return to the Bible. And I'm mindful that this is painful stuff, but it's where we are. if one wants to step back into the huge kind of scholarly discussion about what was happening, Raymond Brown has written a 2-volume commentary called The Death of the Messiah, looking at all 4 of the gospel narratives in great detail. It's a great book, a bit overwhelming, but if you want to know information about a particular event and what happened and so on, how the evangelists present the oral and written traditions, it's great. I mention that simply because Mark is not the only gospel, obviously, and there are additions and omissions, additions to Mark or omissions from Mark or the other gospels that we need to be aware of. For example, the loud cry that Jesus utters at the moment of his death is different in Luke, where Jesus says in Luke, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And there are more last words of Jesus in John, such as, "Behold your son, behold your mother, it is finished. I thirst," and again, "it is finished." So we're talking about interpretations of what happened. But in Mark and Matthew, Jesus' last words on the cross are his only words. In their accounts, after 3 hours of darkness, the crucified Jesus speaks only once. Mark reports Jesus' large cry twice in verse 34 and 37, but there are no words spoken by Jesus the second time. What comes out of Jesus' mouth is loud. And I think of, I can imagine the soldiers listening to him saying, "You're speaking in a loud voice to somebody who's about to breathe your last breath." Phone megale, a megaphone, it's loud. Jesus cries out loudly, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," meaning, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And we know that all crucifixions are painful and distressing. The German scholar Blinzler speaks of, quote, "the screams of rage and pain, the wild curses, and the heartbreaking, nameless despair of the unhappy victims." But the cry of Jesus is very personal. And Raymond Brown points out that in Mark, Jesus quotes Psalm 22, verse 1, in his mother tongue of Aramaic, not in the classical Hebrew of the Psalter or the slightly different forms of the transliterated Aramaic or Hebrew in the other Gospels. And I just want to give you another picture of Jesus crying out. This sculpture by Edilberto Merida. Despite the loudness of Jesus' cry, you notice that huge mouth in the sculpture, God seems not to hear. And this is poignant because in John, Jesus cries out with a loud voice on 2 occasions, and the dead hear him. We think of his calling out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." But now Jesus cannot understand the silence of God, his lack of response. And he questions the silence of the one he calls my God. Interestingly, this is not the way Jesus normally talks to God. He normally speaks to God as Father. And so here we notice a shift from Abba to Eloi, Eli. What does that cry of Jesus mean? And how is that meaning influenced by the other apocalyptic signs of the 3 hours of darkness and the rent temple veil? Should we take this cry literally? I say that because some have resisted it and they've said, well, there may be this literal cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? But surely God didn't abandon his divine son. How could it? It's not possible for Jesus to be separated from fellowship with his Father. And then they'll go on to, grasping at straws, I think, go on to say, of course, Psalm 22 ends on a positive note. And some have argued that Jesus' last breath and the cry, "It is finished," is a triumphal cry of somebody who's calmly and triumphantly fulfilling God's will and God's purpose. But this seems to read against the thrust of the Bible. And of course, it also assumes that Mark's readers would have the whole of Psalm 22 kind of instantly in their head. And of course, even if you do read Psalm 22, much of Psalm 22 is a cry of pain and suffering. You don't have to say Jesus didn't suffer in order to remember Jesus' divine nature, which is also, as Christians, part of his human nature. And the fact that Mark's not forgotten that Jesus was divine is that he records the centurion saying, "Truly this man was Son of God," whether the Son of God or a Son of God. So that thought that Jesus is Son of God is not that far from Mark's mind. But Mark wants to say Jesus here was suffering, as if that were not blindingly obvious. Perhaps needs to be stated because in the apocryphal Gospel of Peter, chapter 4, verse 10, there is the claim made that Jesus suffered no pain when he was crucified. But that's not the biblical picture. It's also important when hearing the phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me?" to remember that Jesus had not lost his faith. He still calls God my God. But whether it was my God in that sort of faithful sense, or my God, which is, the way it's almost like a swear word, he did experience great suffering. All I can say is that surely that is a comfort to us. He is Jesus not only of the scars, Jesus of the scourging, Jesus of the unable to breathe. And so we can identify with Jesus as we witness people who are dying on the streets, dying in the COVID wards, dying from violence against women. And that just as many of these people are innocent and undeserving of death, so Jesus' death is innocent and undeserving. I personally want to resist the idea that he is, as it were, deservedly carrying the sins of the world and God is punishing him. This notion that Jesus was experiencing the wrath of God. I think that's profoundly unhelpful, and especially at this time when so much suffering is around us. One detail that he experienced suffering is simply that he accepts the offer of sour wine from one of the bystanders. He's clearly thirsty and in great pain, and kind of sour wine would be almost like we carry around a little bottle of water, kind of something to refresh you on a hot day. It's the middle of the day. And so Jesus accepts this offer as a form of refreshment and even sedation. Of course, there is that kind of dual edge. The person who gives him the wine is saying, "Oh, well, let's keep this guy going a little longer. Let's see what happens," because we think he's calling out for Elijah. Now, there's the whole question of whether Eli or Eloi sounds like Elias, and it doesn't really sound that similar, and scholars have pointed that out. But it seems appropriate that Elijah should come to mind because of Elijah's symbolic role in the Bible and, of course, in Jesus' story. Remember that Elijah appeared to Jesus with Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration. We can see in Mark chapter 9. And when they discuss Elijah's appearance, Jesus says, Elijah is indeed coming first to restore all things. So this is clearly an understanding that was around. And the roots of that, of course, come from Malachi, the very end of the Hebrew Bible in the canonical form we have it. Lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. So it seems to me plausible again that there would have been this reminder of Elijah, but whether that was, we're talking about a literary text, and we might find that this is a way of aiding reflection on the significance of Jesus' death. I'm mindful that time is moving on, but I'd like to just, as we draw to a close, consider how the gospel writers describe Jesus' death itself. None of the gospels describe it using the ordinary Greek words for dying, apothneiskein or teluta. Instead, Mark and Matthew use the word to breathe out, ekpnein, as a synonym for dying. And this is what started my whole quest for reflecting on the I can't breathe theme, because I don't think it's pushing it too far to say that Jesus got to the point where he could breathe no more. And so the translators say he breathed his last. Mark 15 verse 37 says, but Jesus, having let go a loud cry, having released a loud cry, expired, ekpnein, breathed his last. Matthew 27:50 says, Jesus again, having shouted with a loud cry, let go, same word as in Mark, the Spirit, or lets out his last breath. This is clearly a description of death. This is not releasing the Holy Spirit. And in the George Floyd videos, police videos of his death, it's clear the difference between the alive George Floyd saying I can't breathe and the dead George Floyd who clearly could not breathe. And his still lifeless body is in strong contrast with his powerful struggles earlier on in the incident. There's a lot of shouting in George Floyd video, and also a lot of shouting on the cross, or at least this repeated cry, the loud cry that is mentioned twice in Mark and Matthew. And in John, of course, there is the repetition of the phrase, it's finished, I've done it. When it comes to asking what caused Jesus' death, scholars are unable to say exactly what caused his death. And Bible scholars are often critical of doctors who've taken the symptoms from the Gospels and interpreted them without distinguishing between that which was possibly symbolic and that which was literally happening. In the 20th century, it was normally spoken of, mid-20th century, that Jesus died of asphyxiation. And again, that was in my mind when I saw him breathing his last. And this was inferred from these words in the Gospel, and also, incredibly, the Shroud of Turin. And I think we can set that aside because it's a 13th or 14th century artifact. Interesting in its own right, but not really admissible as evidence for Jesus' death. But more recently, and where I think the current consensus lies, is that Jesus died from hypovolemic shock. That is, in plain language, his loss of water, fluids, his dehydration and blood loss. It's impossible to know for sure, but we do know that Jesus had already been flogged within an inch of his life after his appearance before Pilate. And that alone would have led to a loss of blood and plasma. Put that picture of the Crucifixion, number 2, by William Congdon, an American artist.
We can't see that, David.
Oh dear, I'm surprised. It's just the next. Could you see the one on Elijah? The
No,
sentence?
no, sorry.
Oh dear. Okay, I've clearly screen sharing is well. I will just. I've got a couple of pictures from the Christ We Share book, but let's not worry. Can you see me? Is that what you can see?
We can see you. I think if you screen share, hopefully we
Okay,
could.
let me try again. Sorry. Let me try again. It's. Let's see. Are we there again?
Yeah, we can see your PowerPoint now. Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. There we go. Sorry, it's. I've done a couple of online lectures with others in the past, and there was a lot of. We took hours of rehearsal, and clearly it would have been well spent here too. Thanks for your patience. I offered this picture simply to show the picture of Jesus drained of fluids and dead. I think that is the picture that that depicts, for me, the body when the breath is gone, and one might say also the blood has drained. And for me, this image and the images of George Floyd's death and the images which we haven't received of people coming to the end of their life on ventilators in hospital. We've not seen what happened to Sarah Everard at the end of her life, but this picture symbolizes the body when the life force has gone. So I want to end with simply with the question of how did we get here and how do we get home? To switch back to the earlier symbol of darkness, the 3 hours of darkness, I think we have lived through real darkness over the past year, and to a degree that darkness continues. The darkness symbol connects us with the darkness at the time of Jesus' death. But again, there is a difference between the darkness observed by the onlookers and the darkness of the person who has died, as Jesus did, feeling abandoned and alone. We as onlookers, bystanders, as we watch at a distance, as people breathe their last, we have these strong emotions of shock, fear, grief, and anger. My last slide is the Mexican work of the crucifixion. Even now, as we watch COVID deaths rise in Europe and elsewhere again, we wonder what those who have died actually experienced in their last moments. We wonder and we don't know, but Jesus' last words give us some pointers. His cry is one of abandonment, yet with faith in God. His last act is a cry and then a final release of breath. And as we think of those who have died this year, or even this day, we wonder, how did she or he die? Was their death COVID-19 related? As happened to one of my sisters who collapsed and died suddenly, and only months later we realized that it was COVID complications. Or was that just part of the violence that is around us all? And we wonder whether our own fear or hatred has indirectly contributed to this violence and when it will end. We ask why Black people and LGBTQI plus people and women are still dying violent deaths today, and what needs to change. As a gay South African friend wrote to me recently, how did we get here and how do we get home? There are no easy answers, but my last slide, I just want to suggest there is hope. And against the abuse of political and military power, Mark tells us that there was a Roman centurion who said, truly, this man was a son of God. Against the fearful thought of people dying alone, the women stay with Jesus while he dies. Against all those who abuse their privilege and power, we meet a member of the Jewish council who gives his own tomb for Jesus' body. And against death itself, Jesus' body is not in the tomb. I'll stop there.